Thank you, Judge, and on behalf of Jennifer Rabb, who is en route as well, President of Hunter College, it's such a pleasure to have you here at a perfect moment, as some of you may have seen in the exhibit in what we call the Sarah Delano Roosevelt Parlor. We are marking several things. It's about to be the 75th anniversary of the day that Eleanor presided over the turning over of the family home to Hunter College. President Roosevelt was on board the USS Iowa on his way to Tehran when that transfer took place, subject, interestingly, to a torpedo attack by an American destroyer. But that's a whole other story. See me later for the details. And 70 years ago, we're marking the 70th anniversary of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, which Eleanor, of course, championed. And in our prelude, in our reception tonight, we are gathered, and I hope I'm not stepping on Alita's story, but we are gathered in quite a historic room, because it's the room that marked the opening of Roosevelt House in a different way. Very briefly, this house is the wedding gift of Sarah Delano Roosevelt to Franklin and Eleanor. They began their occupancy in 1905, and soon thereafter, Sarah took one look at the two dining rooms where we stand tonight and said, and I paraphrase liberally, much too small for people of our station, let's open the dining rooms. And from that day forward, as Eleanor said, her mother-in-law was on her side of the house at the most unexpected moments. So we who are on this side are in Sarah Delano Roosevelt's dining room. Those of you who are nearer the painting of Eleanor are in the Franklin and Eleanor side, and those of you who are straddling the middle, you have yet to make up your mind.
Okay, I just have one question.
Yes.
You put me on the Sarah side.
You
I'm
can.
just teasing him. I love it.
Alita, you should do both. You should do all sides. You should stroll, right? What also happened once the house was opened up was that it became almost unbearable and untenable for Eleanor to hang around all the time, because Sarah was on her so much about her failures in such essential roles as housekeeping, cooking, cleaning, and mothering. She said, why don't you get out? Why don't you go to the Henry Street settlement to do some work, do something outside of the house? And Eleanor was thrilled to have the opportunity. So in a way, this lady, who was not the easiest person to live with, also launched Eleanor on her career in public service and human rights advocacy, even if it was only by making life unbearable in the house. We hope you find it bearable. We're so thrilled to have you here, and the great Mr. Ferenz, and of course, Secretary Clinton soon. Welcome, have a wonderful time, and we'll see you upstairs.
Thank you, Mr. Holzer. And he is the director of the Roosevelt House Public Policy Institute at Hunter College. And we thank you. I now want to recognize the Roosevelt family. Eleanor Roosevelt is our adopted patron saint at the Center for Human Rights, not just because we love her for who she was and for what she meant to the international and the national community, but also for what she had to say and how she boldly took a leadership stance on issues that really transformed the world. Of course, it would have been entirely inappropriate and inauthentic to have claimed her name for this award without the blessing of the Roosevelt family. So we reached out to them, and we were deeply gratified that they readily agreed to it. And we were doubly blessed when they suggested that Eleanor's great-granddaughter, Tracy Roosevelt, a young lawyer now based in Washington, D.C., serve as the family's ambassador to the center in developing the award and this inaugural event. She has been a phenomenal partner. As co-chair of this event with my good friend and former CHR chair, Walter White, Tracy Roosevelt has been a phenomenal partner indeed, and I'd now like to welcome her to say a few words and to introduce Professor Black, who also has been tremendously helpful to us in this inaugural event. Tracy.
Good evening. It's such a pleasure for me to be here with all of you at Roosevelt House. As you know, this house has a very special historical connection to my family. You heard earlier from Mr. Holzer that over 100 years ago, this house was a wedding present from my great-great-grandmother, Sarah Delano, to my great-grandparents, Franklin and Eleanor. What an amazing wedding present to get a house on the Upper East Side. However, we also know it came with a slight catch. Every door in this house connected to Sarah Delano's house. Hunter College has done an amazing thing by creating a study center and conference space in this historic location. I know my great-grandmother would be especially pleased at the role that her first house as Franklin's wife has now played for New York City. You'll hear more from me later this evening, but right now it's my pleasure to introduce Alida Black. Alida is the managing director of the Allenswood Group, which advises women leaders on the preservation and the contemporary application of their archival records, and advises non-governmental organizations and civic educational associations on the importance of human rights education. For example, in this role, she advises former Liberian President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. She also serves on the board of the Ellen Johnson Sirleaf Foundation and on the Women's Campaign School of Yale board. In 2013, Alida drafted Hillary Clinton to run for president by co-founding and chairing the super PAC Ready for Hillary. Later, during Secretary Clinton's 2016 presidential campaign, Alida ran Let's Talk Hillary and traveled to 39 states, working tirelessly to get Secretary Clinton elected. In Alida's day job, she is the research professor of history and international affairs at the George Washington University.
Well, sort of.
You can clarify. And she's also editor emeritus and advisory board chair of the Eleanor Roosevelt Papers. She has written and edited critically acclaimed multimedia publications on Eleanor and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. She's also written 10 books about women, politics, and human rights. She has managed a project that documents the construction of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the covenants, and the proposed enforcement mechanisms, and provided a blueprint for action. She has led workshops around the world on human rights, conflict resolution, women and girls empowerment. If I had to pick one person who has done the most to steward my great-grandmother's legacy, it would be Alida Black. I have had the pleasure of being Alida's friend for the last 20 years. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce her to all of you.
Oh, Lord, following Tracy Roosevelt. I thank you very much, but for the record, just because I'm paranoid and I'm a historian and I believe in facts, I was at GW for a long time, and now I have an honorary position just so that I can continue to use the library. Okay, but it is my joy to work with President Sirleaf and be on call for the secretary when she needs me. So I am grateful to be here. This house and your great-grandmother have a very interesting connection to the Declaration. And, you know, I would tweak my dear friend Harold just a little bit. I would say that she started at Rivington Street Settlement House before she came to Roosevelt House, and then in fact that it was Mademoiselle Marie Souvestre who pushed her in that direction, but it was Sarah who said you have to stop. But it was Sarah who then began to see the errors of both their ways, and as Deborah Gardner, who is here and is the unsung hero, in my opinion, of Roosevelt House, who did this extraordinary exhibit on Eleanor and the Declaration of 70. You should all go in there. I mean, she's a gift to the flippin' world and has saved my butt more times than I can count. So, But what the connection between Roosevelt House and the Declaration is, this is where Eleanor first realized she had to be her own person, and that she had to develop her own political networks as FDR began to grapple with the unacknowledged realization that he would never walk again. You will never hear him say that publicly. But at Roosevelt House is where he really understood this. And his soul battle, if you will, between Roosevelt House and Hyde Park and Warm Springs in Georgia is where he put all of the parts of FDR together. It was here that FDR was the New York Paul and the social dandy. It was at Warm Springs that he realized the pernicious effects of poverty and the struggle that it would take to get his legs back, and the heartfelt bond that he created with fellow polio patients, regardless of their income, education level, or status. But Eleanor supported his decision to give this house to Hunter College full throttle. And when they first gave it to Hunter, and I say this as a segue into Eleanor's role on crafting the Declaration, she wanted it to be used for a multi-faith, interfaith council. And why was that important to her? This was a woman whose view of faith was profoundly ecumenical. And the war changed her in ways that, unless you've been in combat or in the hearts of a refugee camp or in the throes of an epidemic, it's hard for us to understand. She, when she went to the Pacific, which she was able to do in 1943 after she was blamed for a race riot in the United States, she wrote to Trude Lash, "The war fills me with the greatest sense of dread the greatest sense of responsibility that I dread that I will never be able to discharge." She carried a prayer with her in her wallet that initially she cut out of a magazine, and then she rewrote and rewrote and rewrote. And unlike popular culture that says it's the St. Francis of Assisi prayer, it was a very different prayer. It was, "Dear Lord, lest I continue in my complacent ways, help me to remember that somewhere someone died for me today. And if there be war, help me to remember to ask and to answer, am I worth dying for?" So on the horrors of the Great Depression, and remember that Eleanor Roosevelt went everywhere without Secret Service, unguarded, including into coal mines, which was a taboo in the mid-1930s. And in fact, when she comes out of the coal mine, you have that extraordinary New Yorker cover, right? Well, cartoon, but that's really a very sanitized version of that cartoon. When that cartoon first came out, it was Eleanor Roosevelt with soot on her face. And there was an extra line under, "Oh my God, it's Mrs. Roosevelt." No, it's not, it's a fill in the blank. So she's learning the hardships and the peril that economic and social degradation bring to people's courage to dream, and without dreams, she believes, you can't build a better world. And so how does this relate to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? Well, in 8 minutes, I want you to envision this. Eleanor Roosevelt had 4 years of education. I'm not talking college. I'm not talking graduate school. I'm not talking law school. I'm talking 4 years of education. She was conversant with all the religions of the world. She read widely, and she taught herself 6 languages. she did not want to go to the UN. And in fact, she was appointed to the UN in December of 1945 because she had begun her full throttle assault on Harry Truman for not being able to lead in times of crisis. Because Truman does not give him Hail Harry until 47 and 48. And so Truman turns to Jimmy Burns from South Carolina, who had been on the Supreme Court, who left to help Truman, to say, my God, what can I do to get her off my back? And he thinks, let's send her to the UN. You know, you can get the Roosevelt Stardust, you know, and for sending her over. And my God, she can't cause any trouble. She's not a lawyer. Well, so when the call initially comes to her, she does not want to go for all of the reasons that I've just said. It's her secretary and longtime assistant, Tommy Thompson, who says to her, are you flipping kidding? This is Alita speak. You know all the leaders of the world. You've spent 3 weeks in combat. You've blown out your eardrum. You've ruined your feet, you know, so that you cannot walk without special shoes. You're in trenches. You're in submarine warfare. You're in unpressurized cabins. You have been to refugee camps all over the world. You have seen poverty. You've seen World War I. You've seen World War II. What is wrong with you? So she calls the president back, and she accepts. So she accepts her role, really. She thinks her role is going to be a figurehead. And then John Foster Dulles and William Vandenberg come to her on the Queen Elizabeth and say, Mrs. Roosevelt, we have decided that you should be on Committee 3. And Eleanor, who is dutifully reading through all the briefing books, hadn't made it to Committee 3 yet. And so she doesn't want to blow it. And so she says, her first response, she writes, is that why did they pick my assignment when all of the boys get, that's her words, get to pick theirs? And so she goes back, she reads everything, and Committee 3, as every person in this room knows, is the committee that will be, you know, the home to the High Commission on Human Rights. And so when she is there, she's giving speeches about the glory of the UN and really not doing a lot of work. And then the Security Council totally focuses on the bomb and ignores the refugee crisis. And it is the refugee crisis that pushes her into the declaration, because she ends up having to debate Wyszynski. And I want you to think of James Earl Jones with the cutthroat nature of, and the brutal honesty, and in his way, integrity of John McCain. I mean, a maverick in his own right, but was the single best debater in the world. And the guys aren't ready to debate him, and so they turn to her, and she has to pick up a piece of paper, and write 4 words down, get her nails done, and then she goes back and she debates him. And in the process of that, it's the first time that Wyszynski has been out-debated on the floor of the United Nations. At this point, there are 51 members of the United Nations. 50 of them go to her and say, Mrs. Roosevelt, we want you to chair the commission, the nuclear committee, charged with drafting the declaration. And she's very reluctant, but she's not a lawyer. And you notice I left one nation out that was opposed to it. Anybody want to guess who that was? Us! We didn't want her. But she goes in, and after more than 3,300 hours of meetings over 2 years, dealing with a nuclear committee that is made up of 18 people who don't agree on God, don't agree on whether money exists, don't agree on marriage, don't agree on the role of children, don't agree on citizenship, don't agree on the role of government. The only thing they believe is, by God, we beat the Germans. And what she is able to do in that is to forge consensus and push the delegates to push their nations to come to an agreement. And she had to push the United States because we very much did not want economic, social, and cultural rights in the Declaration. This is the era of Jim Crow. Truman has not desegregated the military yet. The Democratic Party was the party of the South. You know, it was, and the Roosevelt coalition is fracturing in 1948. You'll have a Dixiecrat candidate. You know, you're going to have a Democratic candidate. You're going to have a Republican candidate. You're going to have a progressive candidate. And so there is no consensus. And through the force of her diligent reading and through her bedrock understanding and negotiating with the Soviets, negotiating with the British who were opposed to the Declaration, negotiating with Hansa Mehta from India, negotiating with folks from Australia, as well as us and the Soviet bloc to form consensus. And the consensus is that, of course, you must have political and civil rights. Of course, you must have access to education. Of course, you must have free speech. But the combination of the Great Depression and the war taught her a fundamental lesson that was driven home by her by the tasks, the onus tasks that the UN delegated her once she got to Europe. She was the first American who was non-military to go to the refugee camps and the Holocaust camps. She met with thousands and thousands of refugees. She got thousands of letters unsolicited every day about the plight of their lives and their fear for what is to come. And Eleanor turns to realize a fundamental thing, and that is that the focus on the bomb creates an aura of fear that says the World War III is right around the corner with the most heinous, unimaginable, despicable weapons the world has ever seen. World War II came 20 years after World War I. Now everybody is terrified that World War III is going to be right around the corner with the bomb. And she says to a young student who writes her, I have, in a personal, confidential, not for publication letter, that I have learned what it is like in my own life to live a life that is defined by fear. When in reality, all we have to have is the courage to look ourselves in the mirror and take one step at a time. And so the Declaration to her was a clarion call to the world to say, yes, there will be war, but we can mitigate war. Yes, there will be discrimination and hunger and violence and lack of education and instability. But we can figure out how to manage that in a way that will make it decrease and give hope to the rest of the world. So the Declaration to her was not just an antidote to the war, not just an antidote to the Great Depression, but a clarion call for all of us to reach down inside ourselves, to envision a world, and then risk ourselves to do it. And what do I mean by that? Now I have to say I come from a family of lawyers. My closest friends are lawyers. I brought my pal, Michael Schiffer, Michael Cooper, who's a lawyer, to dinner tonight, okay? But the number one opponent of the Universal Declaration is the group that's in this room, was the American Bar Association. And so it was Eleanor Roosevelt who had to go around the country to debate the ABA, to get the ABA to stop saying that social and economic rights were in fact a socialist and communist plot. But that, I'm serious, but in fact were a fundamental ingredient of what the democratic with the little d vision meant. So being in this room tonight, it's just phenomenal. It is so ironic. It is just, I'm standing in Sarah's spot with the ABA coming together to celebrate Eleanor's vision and her courage and her sheer pragmatic political prowess. Because I believe with every fiber of my being, and after 20 years of scholarship on this, that had Eleanor not agreed in 1947 that we needed to separate the covenants from the Declaration and separate the court from the Declaration, but pursue all three simultaneously, we would never have a declaration. Because, and I'm quoting her, lawyers would spend 3 years debating where to put a comma. And so Eleanor learned to talk law. She learned to talk philosophy. She was a born diplomat. But she also understood how to make this vision accessible. And so my favorite example of her negotiating skills, after these 3,300 hours of negotiation, after getting it through all of the committees, after getting it through ECOSOC, and getting ready to go to the General Assembly, what did she do? She went to every member of the United Nations staff, from the custodians to the cooking team to the secretariat, to make sure that it resonated with them. Because if the vision wasn't clear and legally binding, the vision would fail. And I would argue that was the single most important contribution that she made to the Declaration when she forced Truman and Lovett, over the threat of her resignation, to include social, economic, and cultural rights, and worked with Wyszynski not to object to the political and civil rights. That's how we got the Declaration. And so I think it is enormously fitting that the ABA named this award after her, because she was a fierce negotiator, a woman who believed in the rule of law, a woman who risked her family, her reputation, her physical safety, and her income to see this through, and then championed it until she died, and ultimately helped sway the ABA here. So thank you all very much for coming, and I'm profoundly grateful for your work.